Hey guys, tonight we enter a world where the air tastes like blood and velvet, where kings sleep with daggers under their pillows, and kindness is a weapon only the cunning know how to wield. You're not lounging in a democracy anymore, my friend. You're trudging through the foggy corridors of human nature, where every smile could be a trap and every handshake a prelude to betrayal. You're not here to relax. You're here to learn how power works and why you must acquire it at all costs. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this little philosophical cult reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake in a world that pretends to value peace, fairness, and kindness. But underneath the surface, just beneath the smooth skin of civilization, there's an older, rawer law humming in the bones of every human being. The law of dominance. You see it in toddlers fighting over toys, in corporate boardrooms full of strategic silences and practiced smiles, in governments pretending to protect while quietly seizing. Power isn't a luxury. It's not even a want. It's a survival need buried deep beneath your polite smiles and your no worries. If you don't have it, you're prey. And nobody wants to be prey, not consciously anyway. You trudge through a day where you compromise again. You keep the peace, you nod at your boss, you suppress the real thoughts, and it feels noble for about 5 seconds, then it starts to rot quietly. That little ache in your chest, that creeping resentment, that whisper that says I could have pushed back, but I didn't, that's the toll of the powerless. Mainstream psychology likes to dress this up. Talks about co-regulation, attachment wounds, or narcissistic enmeshment. But let's drop the soft talk. At its core, much of what you call trauma is simply a life lived under the foot of someone else's power. People raised in emotionally abusive homes often learn one thing early. Power is dangerous, so stay small. But here's the Machiavellian nightmare. If you stay small too long, you start to disappear. People step over you like you're part of the floor. You see it in relationships. The one who controls less loses more. You see it in politics. The one who plays fair gets devoured by the one who doesn't. You see it in biology. Even in packs of wolves, there's always an alpha. And guess what? The alpha doesn't beg. Back in 1954, psychologist John French proposed 5 types of social power: coercive, reward, legitimate, referent, and expert. Nice framework. But Machiavelli didn't need categories. He knew something older. The one who controls outcomes controls reality. Power doesn't care how you got it, it only cares that you keep it. And here's your first uncomfortable truth tonight. You already live inside a power structure. Whether you acknowledge it or not, your job, your friendships, your own family. Someone always has more leverage than someone else. And pretending otherwise doesn't make you ethical. It just makes you easy to use. Remember that time you felt sick to your stomach because you couldn't say what you really thought? Or you bent backward to please someone who wouldn't notice if you vanished? That's not emotional sensitivity. That's the disorientation of a person with no sword and too many open doors. Fringe research has explored the phenomenon of learned powerlessness. It's the idea that after repeated failures or suppression, people begin to believe they can't change their outcomes. They stop trying, they smile politely while dying slowly. That's you on autopilot. That's you every time you let someone else rewrite your script. Machiavelli knew this before it had a label. He didn't trust fate or morality or human goodness. He trusted opportunity and boldness. He knew power doesn't show up gift-wrapped. It's seized, ripped, wrestled, and then held with blood still dripping off the edges. So you start to wonder, what if power isn't about controlling others but about never being controlled again? But don't get sentimental yet. Power corrupts. Sure, that's the bedtime story. But here's the adult version. power reveals. It doesn't make you worse. It just shows who you really are when you don't have to smile anymore. Here's a quirky tidbit. In ancient Rome, victorious generals were given a slave during their triumph parade. The slave's job? Whisper in the general's ear, "Remember, you are mortal." Power makes gods out of men, even if just in their heads. The smart ones anchor themselves. The fools float into madness. And scholars still argue whether power is inherently addictive, or if it's just the first taste of real autonomy most people ever get. Either way, it's potent. It rewires your posture, your language, your relationships. You start walking like consequences don't apply, and sometimes they don't. So tonight, you confront it. The myth that you can live a good life without ever holding power. A beautiful lie, really, and if it comforts you, hold on to it. But if you're tired of shrinking, tired of being polite while your spine snaps, then you begin to listen. The world isn't built for the powerless, and no one is coming to rescue you, not your therapist, not your partner, not some sudden epiphany that makes it all okay. Only power changes things, slowly, quietly. Then all at once. You walk into a dim-lit study, dust particles dancing in shafts of light, leather-bound books lining the walls, and at the center of it all, Niccolò Machiavelli. Not the monster you've heard about, not some demonic puppeteer pulling strings from the shadows, but a man, worn and bitter, writing not from a throne, but from exile. A man discarded by the very power he once advised. He doesn't scream, he doesn't plead, he writes. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. That's the line that gets everyone's panties in a knot. But you trace the ink with your finger and realize he wasn't preaching evil, he was documenting survival, observing the jungle from the edge of the clearing, watching the deer, yes, but also the wolf. Machiavelli didn't invent manipulation, he just stopped lying about it. You look around today's world and see the same dance. Politicians smile as they cut funding. Influencers post vulnerability while selling detox teas. CEOs preach teamwork while laying off half their staff by email. You think you're better because you're honest? Machiavelli would chuckle softly and pour you another glass of wine. He wrote The Prince not as a moral compass, but as a field manual, a tactical guide for those who must navigate a world where ethics get you crucified faster than mistakes, where purity invites predators, where survival means knowing when to fake compassion and when to kill your enemy's entire bloodline. Too dramatic? Ask any historian what royal families did to secure succession. Spoiler, they didn't hug it out. In Florence, Machiavelli watched power swing like a pendulum between republics and tyrants, popes and princes. He saw friends beheaded, writings banned, secrets sold for scraps. He learned quickly, if you can't sit on the throne, at least stand close enough to whisper in the king's ear. Here's your mainstream fact for tonight. Modern political science still credits Machiavelli as the father of realism. The idea that nations, like men, pursue self-interest, whether or not they admit it. It shaped Cold War doctrine, international relations, even your high school debate team. You just didn't realize you were all quoting a man from 1513. Now here's the weird tidbit. The Prince was banned by the Catholic Church for centuries, yet it was secretly read by almost every serious ruler after him. Banned in public, studied in private, like a sharp knife hidden in a prayer book. You hear him whisper, "A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything is bound to come to ruin among so many who are not good." And you feel something in your chest tighten. Because you've been there. You've been the one who said, "I just want to do the right thing," and watched everyone else win by doing the opposite. Machiavelli wasn't heartless. He was clear-eyed. He didn't say, "Don't love." He said, "Don't let love make you stupid." He didn't say, "Don't be kind." He said, "Know when kindness is lethal." Power doesn't mean becoming a monster. It means you no longer have to beg monsters to spare you. He'd tell you, you don't need to dominate everyone. Just enough to keep yourself free. Just enough to ensure your choices aren't dictated by someone else's fears. Just enough to stop apologizing for needing space, safety, or silence. But scholars still argue, was Machiavelli describing human nature as it is or as it should be? Was he warning us or arming us? You pace that room again, centuries old and heavy with ink. The weight of power doesn't sit evenly. Machiavelli knew that. He knew some people break under it, others twist. A rare few learn to carry it with grace, with blood on their hands but clarity in their gaze. You don't need to be a tyrant. But if you can't fire someone when it's necessary, if you can't say no without trembling, if you can't confront betrayal without collapsing, then you're not ready for real freedom. Because freedom is violent, not always outwardly, but internally. It kills the people pleaser, the approval addict, the martyr who thinks suffering earns you points with some cosmic referee. Machiavelli would have hated modern self-help. All that just be your authentic self-talk. He knew the world doesn't reward authenticity, it rewards strategy, masks, timing, silence that screams louder than words. And yet he wasn't cynical, not completely. He believed great leaders could still do great things if they were willing to get their hands dirty, if they understood that sometimes mercy is a luxury, one you offer only after you've secured the win. So tonight, as you breathe quietly in your bed, you imagine this man, exiled, broke, disgraced, crafting a blueprint that would outlive kings. That would teach future generations how to lead armies, win elections, and survive office politics without losing their minds. He doesn't want you to become a villain. He wants you to stop being a victim. And somewhere deep down, you realize he's not whispering from behind the throne anymore. He's whispering to you. You're standing in the middle of a crowded room now. The kind where everyone is smiling, nodding, clinking glasses, and pretending they don't secretly want something. A promotion. A second chance, an upper hand, maybe even your downfall. And in this sea of masked civility, one question starts to ring inside your skull like a hidden gong. Is kindness a virtue, or just camouflage? You've been told your whole life to be good, be generous, be polite, do unto others. But you start to realize slowly and with growing nausea that kindness isn't always born from love, it's often strategy. And when used properly, it's one of the most effective weapons of control ever invented. You watch the kindest people manipulate entire rooms without raising their voices. That manager who really cares about the team, but somehow always gets her way. That friend who listens so well but remembers every word you say and uses it later. That religious leader who preaches sacrifice while living in a mansion. But Machiavelli would scoff. He'd say kindness is only power if it's deliberate. If it's timed. If it can be withdrawn like a loaded gun, not handed out like Halloween candy. He'd also remind you, people aren't loyal to the kind, they're loyal to the useful. Now here's your mainstream fact for tonight. Studies in behavioral psychology, especially those on altruism and social reciprocity, show that kindness increases status when it's rare. People perceive generosity as strength until it becomes obligation. Then they exploit it. That's when your kindness starts feeling like currency you can't stop spending. And here's the fringe tidbit you didn't expect. In ancient Egypt, some servants were buried alive with their rulers as a gesture of loyalty. That wasn't love. That was power disguised as virtue, a manipulation so deep it extended beyond death. You feel it too, don't you? The subtle sickness when you say yes and your soul whispers no, when you forgive too fast, when you offer help because you're scared of losing approval. That's not kindness. That's survival without boundaries. But Machiavelli didn't say never be kind. He said control your kindness. Don't let it leak out of you. Don't use it to bribe love or buy silence. If you must be generous, make sure it's visible, public, memorable. He wrote that injuries should be inflicted all at once, but benefits should be doled out slowly, because the brain remembers pain in flashes and pleasure in fragments. He'd tell you that if you're always kind, people assume it's weakness. They push, they test, they chip away at your spine. But if your kindness arrives like a thunderstorm, brief, rare, impossible to ignore, they'll worship it. Because now it feels like a choice, not a habit. And scholars still argue, is Machiavellian kindness true kindness at all, or is it just theater? But here's the more pressing question. Do you even care if it gets the result you want? You think about your life right now, the favors you do, the apologies you make, the softness in your voice when you're trying not to offend someone who offends you daily. And you wonder, who trained you to think that moral superiority matters more than strategic influence? Machiavelli would call it a beautiful delusion. He'd point to how rulers win loyalty not by being fair, but by appearing fair. He'd say, men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, meaning people believe what they see you do, not what you intend. You could have the purest heart in the world, but if you look weak, you're done. That's why kindness works best with a little menace, a visible edge, a boundary so sharp it can't be mistaken for submission. It's why your most magnetic bosses weren't the nicest. They were the ones who could smile while firing someone, who could defend you in public and correct you in private, who made kindness feel earned, not expected. And it hits you, maybe for the first time. Kindness without power is begging, but power with kindness, that's dominance dressed in silk. You try to remember the last time you said no without explaining, the last time you forgave someone without forgetting, the last time you offered love after you secured respect, not before. Maybe your therapist told you to be compassionate with yourself. Machiavelli would tell you to be strategic with yourself, to use your own emotions like tools, not bandages, not confessions, tools. He'd say, don't be a nice person, be a useful one, be a calculating one, be a storm when needed and a breeze when it serves you. So tonight you start to look at kindness differently. You remember every time someone called you too nice, every time you were overlooked for being easygoing, every time someone took your silence as consent and your help as surrender. And you promise yourself, no more. From now on, kindness is your mask, your lure, your blade wrapped in velvet. It's no longer something you give away like spare change, it's something you deploy. You're sitting across the table from someone you care about, maybe a partner, maybe a boss, maybe a friend. The air is thick with tension, and in the back of your mind, the question burns like acid. Would they still respect me if they weren't afraid to lose me? That's the real question, isn't it? You've probably been told 100 times that relationships, professional, romantic, familial, should be built on love, but Machiavelli grins from the corner and tosses a coin on the table. On one side, love. On the other, fear. Choose wisely, he says, but remember which one disappears faster when things go wrong. You squint at the coin and realize something brutal. Love is fragile. It requires tending, reaffirming, proving. Love on its own is like a leash made of paper, beautiful, breakable, easy to ignore when power shifts. But fear? Fear is concrete. Fear builds walls that last. Fear makes people pause before betraying you because they can imagine the consequences. Even if they love you, they won't always stop themselves. But if they fear you, that stops the hand. That freezes the tongue. That makes survival instinct kick in. Here's your mainstream fact. Neuroscience has shown that the amygdala, the brain's fear center, activates far more rapidly and intensely than emotional centers responsible for affection. Fear imprints faster, sticks longer, and influences behavior even when the original threat is gone. And here's your weird tidbit. In medieval courts, kings often kept pet lions, not just for spectacle, but to remind visitors that the king could control the wild. It wasn't about the lion itself, it was about the image, the message. I tame danger, I am danger. Machiavelli didn't say never be loved. He said don't depend on it, because love is optional, fear is not. He writes, it is much safer to be feared than loved when one of the two must be lacking. It sounds harsh, but think about your own life. Who gets more done in meetings, the one everyone loves or the one no one wants to disappoint? Who gets paid more, The agreeable guy who's fun to work with, or the person who subtly communicates, "Don't mess with me." But scholars still argue over the intent behind Machiavelli's quote. Was he praising fear, or just acknowledging its efficiency? Either way, you now understand the bitter truth. If people don't fear losing you or fear consequences from you, they'll start managing you, negotiating your standards, slowly taking more than they give, until one day you look up and realize you're holding a leash with no dog at the end of it. That's why people lose themselves in relationships, because they lead with love and forget the structure, forget the edge, forget that sometimes boundaries only work if people know you'll enforce them. Think about that last argument where you stayed quiet because you didn't want to fight, or the moment you let a colleague take credit for something to keep the peace, or the way you apologize when you are the one being disrespected. That's not diplomacy. That's a lack of fear, and you can sense it, can't you? That soft erosion of your influence when people get too comfortable crossing lines, when they assume you'll understand, when your love becomes the leash they hold, not you. So tonight you practice something else. Not coldness, not cruelty, just consequence. You stop explaining your no, you say it and let silence do the rest. You enforce the boundary you've been wiggling around for months, and you don't flinch when they react. You let someone stew in the discomfort of disappointing you instead of softening the blow. Because Machiavelli would say this isn't cruelty, it's design, it's structure, it's survival. Fear doesn't mean rage, it means consequence. And love should rest on top of that, not underneath it, like frosting on a cake with steel inside. Sweet, yes, but if they bite wrong, they chip a tooth. You remember this the next time someone says, "You've changed." You haven't. You've just stopped using love as your only tool. Now you've added something sharper. And that, my friend, is how rulers are made. You walk through a cemetery of forgotten names, not literal graves, though there are plenty of those, but the metaphorical tombstones of people who were too good, too honest, too loyal. People who followed every rule, served every cause, gave every last ounce of themselves, and were discarded the moment they became inconvenient. You see them in history books, noble advisors who wouldn't lie, rebels who refused to kneel, lovers who gave without limit, beautiful souls buried beneath systems that never rewarded virtue without leverage. And you realize with a chill, this is what happens to the powerless. They die quietly, they die obediently, and worst of all, they die forgotten. Machiavelli didn't romanticize them, he grieved them in silence, because he knew the world never remembers the well-intentioned losers. It remembers the cunning victors, the ones who lasted. Mainstream historical fact: most of history's power shifts weren't led by the noble, they were led by the ruthless. The American Revolution, rooted in strategy and timing, not just liberty. The French Revolution, spurred by propaganda, fear, and execution cues. Even the civil rights movements of the modern world have always had a Machiavellian undercurrent: strategy, sacrifice, and spectacle. Not just goodness, you admire the peaceful protester. But the reason you can admire them safely today is because someone else out of sight was willing to be feared. Here's your fringe tidbit for tonight. In 12th century China, an official named Yue Fei was so loyal and honorable that he became a symbol of national virtue. So the emperor had him executed. Why? Because Yue Fei was too beloved. Too pure, a threat to power simply by existing. You digest that slowly. In a system built on control, purity becomes danger. Too much goodness gets you erased. You start remembering people you've known, the coworker who took the blame to protect the team, the partner who gave you everything and got nothing in return, the sibling who was always there and always dismissed. And you wonder, is nobility just another word for expendable? Machiavelli saw this in real time. He watched men of conscience be used as shields, then tossed aside when the arrows stopped flying. He watched peacekeepers fall while warmongers rose, and he didn't weep. He took notes. He would say to you now, lying in your soft bed with headphones on and heart slightly aching, do not become one of the beautiful corpses. You think of how many times you let guilt dictate your choices, how many times you stayed silent out of decency, how many times you were the better person and ended up the broken one. And scholars still argue, is this cynicism or clarity? You begin to see the line not as a wall between good and evil, but between visible power and invisible sacrifice. And Machiavelli would urge you, gently, even lovingly, to pick the side that leaves a legacy, not a martyrdom. You don't have to become cruel. You just have to stop offering yourself as kindling every time someone else needs warmth. You remember a conversation where someone said, "But I thought you were nicer than this," and you feel the phantom shame rise in your gut. But now you hear a new voice in your head, "I am kind, but I'm not disposable." You think of how long you've been waiting for people to reward your goodness, and you finally realize they won't. Not unless your goodness comes with teeth. You picture those who died powerless, the forgotten, the saints who never got statues, the quiet ones who were always told to wait their turn. And you decide tonight you won't join them. You will learn the rules, you will acquire leverage, you will stop giving more than you can afford to lose. Because power doesn't corrupt, it protects. And without it, all your noblest qualities become offerings at someone else's altar. You walk past the mirror, glance once, and stop. Not because of what you see, but because of what others might see. You've been trained your whole life to be authentic, to just be yourself. But here's the twist that Machiavelli saw centuries ago. What people think you are matters more than what you actually are. In the brutal game of power, appearance isn't decoration, it's defense, it's bait. Sometimes it's the whole damn castle. You've known this since childhood. You sensed which teachers liked confident kids, which bosses responded better to silence than protest, which partners valued drama over peace. You learned the art of adjusting, smiling when your chest was hollow, laughing when your gut said run. Machiavelli wouldn't call that fake, he'd call it necessary. He wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." And for a man who spent his life in politics, watching men rise and fall based on perception alone, it wasn't theory, it was law. Tonight you remember every time your honesty backfired, every time someone said, "Just be real with me," and then used your truth as ammunition later. Every time you were transparent and found yourself exposed. Mainstream fact: behavioral science confirms that people assess others' trustworthiness, competence, and dominance within milliseconds, based purely on visual cues and vocal tone. That means before you even speak, they've filed you into a folder. And guess what? They don't update that file easily. Here's your weird tidbit. In 18th century France, aristocrats used beauty patches, tiny bits of velvet or silk glued to their faces, not just for fashion, but to convey political leanings, flirtation, or social status. Your face was a battlefield, a chessboard, a billboard. You start to realize that what you wear, how you stand, how you speak, it all whispers something to the world before you even get to explain yourself. And if you're not crafting those whispers intentionally, someone else will do it for you. Machiavelli would advise, look powerful even if you aren't. Project certainty even in doubt. Control the mirror before someone shatters it. Because here's the secret no one tells you. Most people are responding to your reflection, not your reality. That's why weak leaders fall. Not always because they make bad decisions, but because they look like they're about to. You begin to rethink how you show up. That job interview where you downplayed your achievements to stay humble. That breakup where you apologized even though you were the one who should have walked away months earlier. That negotiation where you smiled too soon. all of it, reflection mismanagement. But scholars still argue, does curating your image mean you're deceiving others or simply defending yourself? Is power through appearance manipulation or self-preservation? You know the answer, don't you? You've lived it. You've seen how quickly people lose interest when your pain isn't dressed up as resilience. How often vulnerability gets romanticized after the person is gone. How influence goes to the ones who seem invincible, even if they cry behind closed doors. So you stop giving the world raw footage, you start editing, not lying, just crafting, framing, directing the story before someone else writes a crueler version. And that mirror, it's no longer a place for self-esteem check-ins. It's your workshop. You practice posture that says, I'm unshakable, even when your stomach flips. You rehearse your I'm listening face, calm, unreadable, just the right amount of eyebrow tension. You learn to say, let me think about that, instead of giving your opinion too quickly. Because urgency reveals insecurity, and power never rushes. You finally understand why Machiavelli placed so much weight on perception, because perception builds myth, and myth, when wielded well, becomes untouchable. You stand at the edge of a clearing and you're no longer alone. One animal prowls in front of you, muscles taut, mane trembling slightly in the wind. A lion, majesty, terror, hunger. And just behind it, eyes gleaming in the underbrush, slinks another shape, smaller, lighter, sly. A fox. Machiavelli smiles again. He's the one who led you here. He didn't see human nature as noble or depraved. He saw it as animal. And to survive in the jungle of politics, power, and personal ambition, you must embody the strengths of both predator and trickster. You must be the lion and the fox. He wrote, "The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves." And you realize, with uncomfortable clarity, how often you've been neither. You've walked into traps because you believed someone's tone, their promises, their smiles. You've been devoured by wolves because you were too busy trying to understand them instead of scaring them off. So tonight, you begin your training. Mainstream psychology fact: research shows that people who possess both high cognitive empathy and assertive dominance, what psychologists call dual process leaders, tend to be the most effective in complex environments. Translation: the ones who can read others and strike when necessary are the ones who rise. And here's a strange little historical tidbit. The fox, in ancient folklore across cultures, from Aesop's fables to Japanese kitsune legends, was seen not just as clever, but as shape-shifting. The fox survives not by overpowering enemies, but by becoming whatever the situation requires. So you start studying your own behavioral toolkit, not in shame, but in strategy. When are you lion? The moment you say, "This ends here." The time you stare down manipulation and don't flinch. The hour you let someone leave instead of begging them to stay. That's the roar. That's teeth. That's consequence. And when are you fox? When you withhold your opinion at a tense dinner table, not out of fear, but calculation. When you allow someone to think they've won because the real victory is still 3 moves away. When you smile and say, "I understand," while quietly collecting leverage in the background. Machiavelli would nod. He'd remind you that the fox is not weak. The fox survives where the lion dies, because some wars aren't won through force, they're won through framing, through appearing weaker than you are until the trap springs and the room goes quiet. But scholars still argue, can you really embody both? Doesn't one side eventually take over? And the answer is, you must keep both awake. You've met people who are all lion, loud, confrontational, always pushing. But they burn bridges. They get predictable. Their strength becomes performance. The room starts preparing for their explosions before they walk in. Then there are the all foxes, subtle, charming, elusive. But they lose respect. They get dismissed as manipulators, cowards, whisperers. No one fears them, and over time, no one follows them either. But you begin to practice both. You wear stillness like armor. You smile with edge. You say less in meetings, and when you do speak, your voice carries weight. Because you're not reacting, you're selecting. The lion in you knows when to crush. The fox in you knows when to disappear. And now you think back to every time someone said, "You've changed." Yes, you have. You've stopped choosing between fight and finesse. You've started combining them. You've become unpredictable, and that, in the arena of power, is protection. You're no longer just nice or fierce. You're something deeper, something people sense and can't name. And Machiavelli would say, good, let them wonder. Because when people can't predict you, they can't control you. You leave that clearing tonight with both animals inside you, and you let them roam freely. Because you finally learned the lion makes them tremble, the fox makes sure they never see it coming. You step toward the throne, but before you can reach it, you see the truth. It's not gold, it's not velvet, it's not divine. It's a knife-shaped chair, shimmering with temptation, sharpened by betrayal, and supported by the bones of those who once thought power meant peace. You hesitate, but Machiavelli doesn't. He gestures for you to sit, because he knows power is never safe, power is never soft. And above all, power is never shared for long. You were told leadership is about collaboration, that good rulers empower others, that teams function best when everyone's voice is heard. But Machiavelli would ask you, who has the final say? Because unless you do, you don't hold the power. You hold a title, a costume. You flash back to your own life, to group projects where you did the work, but someone else took the credit. To partnerships where equal slowly morphed into servitude. To family dynamics where being the peacemaker meant swallowing every need you had. And you realize, every time you refused to claim the knife, someone else picked it up and carved their initials into your fate. Here's your mainstream fact. Organizational studies show that in most leadership structures, real authority is concentrated in fewer hands than the hierarchy chart suggests. The illusion of shared control is often maintained to keep morale high, not because decision-making is truly collective. In Renaissance Italy, some rulers would intentionally install slightly unstable or sickly heirs, not because they wanted the kingdom to fall, but because they didn't want to share real power until they were dead. They knew even family can become competition. And Machiavelli advised them accordingly. You start to look around your life. Where are you co-leading when you're really just being controlled? Where are you partnering when you're actually being monitored? Where are you sitting beside someone who's holding the sword behind your back? Machiavelli doesn't believe in equal power, not in practice. He believes in deliberate structure, in visible authority, in protecting the crown even when your head aches from wearing it. He'd say, if you do not own the final word, then your loyalty is optional, and theirs is performative. But scholars still debate, can power ever be benevolent when it's centralized? Can you lead without becoming a tyrant? That's where your edge comes in, because power isn't the problem. Fear of owning it is. You've met people afraid to make final decisions, afraid to claim responsibility, afraid to disappoint. And so they defer, delay, disintegrate, and they get replaced because nature abhors a vacuum, and so does leadership. If you don't claim the throne, someone else will. So you sharpen the blade. You learn to say, I've decided, without apology. You start making calls based on clarity, not consensus. You begin to own your yes and your no without drowning it in sugar. You discover that boundaries don't just protect you from others. They protect others from their own confusion about who's in charge. And when someone challenges you, questions your right to lead, your worthiness, your audacity, you don't argue. You let them stare at the chair, let them feel its edges. Because here's what Machiavelli knew, and what you're finally understanding. The throne isn't about comfort, it's about control, about clarity, about command. And if you're waiting to feel ready, you'll die in line. The crown is heavy, the backrest is sharp, the seat cuts deep, but it's the only place you can stop reacting and start deciding. You sit, and for the first time in your life, silence doesn't feel like tension. It feels like order. You close your eyes and whisper the word morality. It sounds warm, holy, safe. But then you open your eyes and see what Machiavelli saw, something colder, sharper, something used more as a knife than a compass. He would say morality is a luxury for those who've already won, for the ones standing safely behind castle walls, the ones who don't have to choose between betrayal and survival. For everyone else, doing the right thing is often just code for accept your fate quietly. You walk through your own history, your small sacrifices, your ethical stands. That time you told the truth and lost the deal. That moment you stayed loyal and watched someone else get the reward. That year you forgave too many times, and the bruises piled up like prayer beads. And you start to wonder, was that morality, or was that fear dressed up as virtue? Here's your mainstream truth. In real-world behavioral economics, people's sense of morality shifts dramatically depending on perceived risk. It's called moral licensing. Do a good deed, and your brain gives you permission to cut a corner later. But if you feel threatened, suddenly principle becomes negotiable. And here's your twisted tidbit. During the Crusades, warriors were told that killing infidels would ensure their salvation. They weren't just murdering, they were earning heaven. That's what happens when morality gets stapled to politics. The sword becomes sacred. Machiavelli knew this. He didn't trust moral arguments, he trusted outcomes. He'd ask, did your mercy protect your people? Did your honesty preserve your throne? Did your virtue strengthen your rule? If not, it was performance, noise, costume. You think of modern examples. Politicians who preach family values while hiding affairs. Corporations that donate to charities while exploiting workers. Religious leaders who speak of humility from private jets. The world rewards moral appearances, not moral integrity. So what do you do with that? You recalibrate. You stop measuring your goodness by how much you've suffered. You stop treating pain like proof of character. You stop thinking the high road is always the right road, especially when it leads off a cliff. Machiavelli isn't asking you to become corrupt. He's asking you to stop being naive. He'd say, if you must choose between appearing moral and preserving your power, choose power, then use it to do good, because you can't help anyone if you're in chains. But scholars still argue, is this realism or nihilism? Does power excuse anything, or does it demand greater responsibility? And here's where your own moral muscle gets tested. Because now, you're the one making the calls. You decide when to bend the truth, when to pull back mercy, when to look someone in the eye and say, I understand, and still this is the end. It feels awful at first, like betrayal, like failure, like you've stepped out of some invisible line. But then something else kicks in. Clarity, control, the absence of guilt that was never really yours to carry. You remember the time you said no and felt peace for the first time in years. The moment you stood still while someone begged for the version of you who never pushed back. The relief of not justifying your boundaries anymore. That's not evil. That's sovereignty. Tonight, you understand, morality is not fixed. It's fluid. It's political. And if you don't define it for yourself, someone else will weaponize theirs against you. So you become a new kind of moral, one with a backbone, one with discernment, one that helps after it secures the throne. You still believe in kindness, in truth, in loyalty. But only when they serve something higher than your own erasure. Only when they're tools, not traps. Because power without ethics is tyranny. But ethics without power, that's just a bedtime story no one finishes reading. You arrive at the bridge. Behind you, the familiar. The job you've outgrown, the relationship you kept patching, the version of yourself who kept waiting to be chosen. In front of you, a new territory, one where you stop asking, stop justifying, stop performing. But the bridge, it's on fire. You lit it. Machiavelli would nod in approval. He wrote that a wise prince ought not to keep faith when by doing so it would be against his interest. And tonight you translate that into modern tongue. Loyalty without leverage is a liability. You think of all the times you stayed too long, too loyal to a boss who dangled promotions like carrots on fishing wire, too loyal to a friend who disappeared the moment you needed her, too loyal to an identity, a label, a dream that no longer fit, but still wore your name. You were waiting for permission to leave, to level up, to break a promise that no longer served its purpose. But here's the Machiavellian gospel. Burn the bridge first. Because when retreat is an option, people use it. When comfort exists, risk is delayed. When you can always go back, you never fully step forward. Mainstream psychology backs this with a concept called the sunk cost fallacy. You stay invested in something not because it's good, but because you've already paid so much. Time, emotion, identity. You don't want to waste it. But Machiavelli would say the waste isn't walking away, it's waiting until someone else pushes you. You don't owe eternity to what was once right. You owe clarity to what's now right. And your weird historical tidbit? Hernán Cortés, upon arriving in Mexico, ordered his ships to be burned. Why? To prevent his men from retreating. They would win or die, but they would not turn back. That wasn't madness, that was commitment. Tonight you look at your own ships, that backup plan you keep whispering to yourself, that maybe I'll give it one more try scenario, that if all else fails, I can always crutch. Machiavelli would say destroy it, not out of recklessness, out of resolve. Because power isn't just acquired by moving forward, it's secured by eliminating escape. But scholars still argue, is burning bridges too extreme? Doesn't it close future doors? Yes, that's the point. You don't need every door, just the right one. And often, you won't even reach it until desperation pushes you past safety. You know this feeling already. The job you got only after quitting the one that sucked the life out of you. The love you found only after blocking the ex who kept you small. The self you finally became after letting the old you starve in silence. You didn't evolve by easing into it. You leapt, and midair you became someone new. So tonight you say goodbye, not with bitterness, with precision. You send the text, end the contract, archive the folder. You walk away from what might have worked if you had been smaller, more obedient, less awake. So you smile, not because it's easy, but because you finally understand some bridges are meant to burn, because the flames light your next path. You enter the room late, not by accident, but by design, because you've learned something Machiavelli knew centuries ago. The person who arrives last controls the tempo. The person who creates the void gets to fill it. And tonight you discover one of the darker arts of power. If there's no opening for your rise, create one. You've been told to wait your turn, to work hard, to be seen, to stay humble until they notice you. But Machiavelli would lean in close, lower his voice and say, they already noticed. They're just pretending you're not a threat until you make yourself one. Power doesn't shuffle over to make room. It clings, it clutches, it cements. And when it slips, it doesn't fall into the hands of the patient, it falls to the prepared. Here's your mainstream fact. Modern organizational behavior studies confirm that crisis moments are the most common catalyst for leadership change. But what triggers those moments? Often it's not random, it's designed, stirred, agitated just enough for the cracks to spread. And here's your unnerving historical tidbit. Julius Caesar didn't just stumble into absolute power. He engineered chaos in the Roman Senate, undermined alliances, exploited emergencies, until the people begged him to take control, not because he was pure, but because he was ready. Machiavelli admired that, not because he worshipped chaos, but because he understood this brutal truth. Stability protects the status quo. If you want to rise, you may need to disrupt it. You've felt it in the workplace. That glass ceiling that's not made of glass, but of politeness and politics. You've seen how mediocrity protects itself, how the least capable often sit in seats labeled director or founder, how systems defend themselves from real change, even when drowning. So what do? You stop playing nice. You don't explode the building. You start pulling bricks, quietly, strategically. You challenge assumptions in meetings, once, twice, with just enough data to make people uneasy. You build relationships with gatekeepers who feel overlooked. You solve a problem your superior should have solved. You don't shout, you don't sabotage, you just destabilize. And when the moment comes, when the vacuum opens, you're already standing where the floor used to be. But scholars still argue, is that ambition or manipulation? Is creating opportunity through disruption immoral? Machiavelli would say, morality doesn't matter if you're buried under someone else's ceiling. Because here's the thing about power, it's often born from necessity, but it lasts through narrative. So while others panic, you remain calm. While they flail, you present options. While they mourn the loss of how things used to be, you design the blueprint of what's next. Tonight, you begin writing your script for that moment. You gather facts, allies, leverage. You anticipate objections, not to argue, but to dissolve them before they form. You wait, not because you're timid, but because timing is dominance. And when someone finally says, we need someone to step up, your gaze doesn't waver. You don't pitch, you don't plead, you accept. Because Machiavelli would remind you, the throne never goes to the most deserving. It goes to the most prepared, standing still while others panic. Power loves a vacuum, and the one who creates it often becomes its king. You feel it before you see it. That itch behind your neck, that subtle wrongness in the room, the way someone avoids your eyes, the pause before an answer, the joke that slices just a little too deep. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. Machiavelli would say, good, you're finally waking up, because what they call paranoia, he called wisdom. The world tells you to relax, trust more, be open. But Machiavelli, ever the surgeon of human behavior, would lean in and whisper, those who are most trusting often become the first to bleed. You begin to notice the little betrayals that once passed unnoticed. The colleague who casually mentions your mistakes but never your wins. The friend who only calls when she's drowning. The partner who says, I'm not doing anything wrong, with just a hint of smile behind the teeth. And you realize you've spent your life assuming people mean well. They don't. They mean what suits them. Here's your mainstream fact. Evolutionary psychology shows that humans are wired for coalition building, but also for betrayal. Our ancestors survived by knowing when to fake alliance and when to strike. Distrust wasn't a flaw, it was survival strategy. And your odd historical tidbit? In ancient Persia, kings employed a class of royal ears, men trained solely to observe, eavesdrop, and report potential treason. You remember every time you gave someone the benefit of the doubt and got burned, and every time you knew but you overrode your instinct. Because they'd never do that, because it was probably nothing. But Machiavelli? He didn't override, he anticipated. He would tell you that paranoia isn't always fear. Sometimes it's foresight. It's the realization that people change when incentives do, that trust should be earned daily, that even the kindest lips can curl into treachery given the right opportunity. You begin to build your new code. You share less, you listen more, you watch what people repeat about others, because that's what they'll repeat about you. You let people talk longer than they think you're listening. That's when truth slips out. And when someone asks why you've become more reserved, you smile and say, I'm just focusing on my peace. But Machiavelli knows what you're really focusing on: contingencies. You no longer leave your passwords in easy places. You keep screenshots. You document decisions, especially when they feel casual. You understand that betrayal rarely arrives with a scream. It walks in on soft feet. It smells like your favorite perfume. It tells you you're overthinking right before it moves in for the kill. But scholars still debate, is a life lived in suspicion really a life at all? And you whisper back, suspicion isn't the enemy, blindness is. Tonight you stop apologizing for being too observant. You stop explaining why you don't tell everyone everything. You stop giving people second chances when the first one shattered your spine. Because power isn't just about what you do, it's about what you see coming. You start scanning for cracks in voices, inconsistencies in stories, overused flattery. You test loyalties, gently but deliberately. And when someone fails that test, you don't confront, you file. Because Machiavelli would say, information is ammunition and silence is your shield. You're no longer paranoid, you're protected. And that's not fear, that's strategy. You scroll your feed, sit in a meeting, walk into a party, and it hits you. The ones everyone talks about, they all have enemies. Not polite disagreements, not civil debates. Enemies. Someone who hates their guts, someone who attacks them online, someone who mimics them behind closed doors, someone who secretly, and not so secretly, wants to see them fall. And strangely, that doesn't weaken them, it feeds them. Machiavelli would smirk. He wrote that a prince who has more to fear from his own people than from foreigners must build his defenses accordingly. In other words, internal enemies aren't accidents, they're assets if you know how to use them. You start to realize enemies shape your myth. They give your supporters someone to defend you against. They define your edges. They keep your name in other people's mouths, even when you're silent. No one gathers a crowd like a villain. And here's your mainstream fact. Studies in media psychology show that public figures who are seen as divisive often garner more attention, engagement, and loyalty than those who remain neutral. The brain is hardwired to notice threat and drama. And the weird tidbit? Ancient rulers would sometimes invent enemies, fabricate whispers of revolt, spread rumors of plots that didn't exist. Why? To unite their followers through fear, to keep attention, to stay essential. You begin to see your own life differently. That coworker who undermines you, not just a headache, a chance to prove dominance. That ex-friend who talks behind your back, free marketing, let them speak. That critic online, a billboard you didn't have to pay for. Machiavelli would urge caution, of course. Not every enemy is worth feeding, but he'd tell you to select them, to keep a few, the visible ones, the loud ones, the ones who confirm your importance just by hating you. He'd say, when you make enemies, make sure everyone knows. Because enemies give you shape. Give your audience a choice. Give your mythos teeth, and you've seen it already. The manager who became iconic after firing the lazy team member. The author who blew up because of a Twitter war. The friend who rose higher after being called too ambitious. It's not sabotage, it's spotlight. But scholars still argue, does courting enemies breed toxicity? Does it make leadership dangerous? And the answer Machiavelli would give is terrifyingly simple. Only if you forget you're the one writing the story. Enemies aren't dangerous when you keep them where you can see them. You start managing yours now. You don't retaliate, you respond strategically. You don't try to silence them, you amplify them just enough for contrast. You let their criticism become a backdrop to your calm. You let their chaos highlight your control. You never defend yourself desperately. You let your results speak. Let their noise echo off your silence. Let the crowd do the math. Because here's the irony. The moment you try to please everyone is the moment you vanish. No one follows the forgettable, they follow the polarizing. So you stop playing safe. You speak clearly, decide firmly, show up fully. You let the wrong people dislike you loudly, because that's how the right people find you. You don't need fewer enemies, you need better ones. You flip open a history book and run your finger down the pages. Wars, coups, revolutions, billion-dollar empires, canceled icons. The people who win don't ask for permission. They act, then justify. They strike, then spin the story. They win first and explain later. Machiavelli wouldn't just approve, he'd clap. He wrote, "One must consider the final result," meaning outcomes justify everything. The dead don't debate methods. You start thinking about how much of your life has been shaped by hesitation. You've paused on bold ideas because you were scared of what people might say. But Machiavelli would lean in with his wineglass and whisper, "There is no right moment. There is only action, and the story you tell after." Mainstream behavioral science agrees, strangely enough. In negotiations, those who act assertively, even if their plan is imperfect, often come out ahead. People interpret action as confidence and confidence as competence. Perception becomes momentum. Napoleon once said, "If you start to take Vienna, take Vienna." Half measures, indecision, overthinking, that's what kills empires. You start to notice how many public figures only got questioned after they fell. Their questionable methods, their arrogance, their choices, suddenly scandalous only once they were no longer winning. You think about how many people you admire, and how many of them did exactly what you're afraid to do. They ignored protocol, they upset someone, they pushed through, they made a mess and cleaned it up after the crown was on their head. But scholars still argue, is this recklessness or brilliance? Is acting without full consensus dangerous? Of course it is. That's what makes it work. You don't build an empire by committee. You build it with blood, certainty, and narrative. Tonight, you begin your new approach. You pitch the idea before it's perfect. You draw the line before you over-explain. You launch the project before they all agree. You hit send while your finger still shakes. And when the backlash comes, you absorb it, then reframe it. You say, "Yes, I moved fast because it mattered." You say it wasn't reckless, it was necessary. You say history doesn't remember the cautious, only the victorious. Because power doesn't belong to the flawless, it belongs to the fearless. You stop thinking like a guest in your own life. You become the host, the architect, the final editor. And if people grumble, let them. You'll rewrite the story when you win. You sit on the edge of your bed, the room quiet, your breath steady. It's late, and the world around you sleeps. But inside, something ancient stirs. A recognition, a verdict, a final truth that Machiavelli whispered to the powerful. And now, to you. You are either a player or a pawn. There is no middle. You've lived too long in the in-between, hoping your goodness would protect you, hoping your silence would be read as wisdom, hoping your patience would be repaid. But Machiavelli would lean in with that half smile and say, "Hope is not a strategy. Hope is how pawns wait to be sacrificed." You think back to every room where you were told to stay in your lane, every job where you trained your replacement, every relationship where your kindness became their expectation, and you realize you weren't loved, you were used. Not maliciously, just conveniently. Because when you don't play the game, someone always plays it around you. And when you don't learn the rules, someone always rewrites them against you. Machiavelli wouldn't shame you, he'd sharpen you. He wrote, "It is necessary to be a fox in order to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves." And if you've made it this far tonight, it means you're ready. Not to pretend, not to posture, to play. Mainstream fact? In corporate behavioral studies, the people who rise aren't always the smartest. They're the ones who know how things work. They see the patterns, the power clusters, the subtext behind every compliment. They navigate the maze, not because they love it, but because they refuse to die in it. And your final odd tidbit? In Renaissance courts, jesters, yes, the fools, were often the most politically protected members of the inner circle. Why? Because they could speak truths wrapped in humor. Their mask made them untouchable. They weren't pawns, they were silent players. You start to realize something powerful. You don't have to change your values, you just have to weaponize them. Kindness becomes selective. Honesty becomes timed. Loyalty becomes earned. You don't stop being you, you start being strategic with you. And scholars still argue, is this the death of authenticity? No, it's the birth of sovereignty. Because players choose, pawns wait, players direct, pawns react, players sacrifice, but only when it leads to checkmate. You think of the life you want, not just peace, but control over peace. Not just love, but respect within love. Not just success, but the ability to define it on your own terms. And Machiavelli would say, then step onto the board like you own it. You start tomorrow differently. You walk into rooms as if they were built around you. You speak with brevity, not to hide, but to reveal only what earns interest. You listen like you're mining for leverage. You smile like a fox. You move like a lion. And when someone asks what changed, you say nothing because players don't explain. They win. And now as the night deepens and your thoughts settle like ash after fire, you exhale slowly. Not because the work is done, but because the understanding has landed. You've seen the landscape for what it is. The smiling daggers, the hollow praise, the silent assassinations of the naive. But now you're not naive, you're awake, and there's peace in that. You won't storm through life swinging wildly. You'll walk with clarity, with restraint, with precision. Like someone who knows that real power isn't loud, it's deliberate, it's earned in silence, it's felt in the pause between words. You won't need to fight every battle, just the ones that position you, that elevate you, that protect you. And you'll know when to walk away without fanfare, when to burn the bridge without guilt, when to cut the cord without bleeding. Because Machiavelli didn't teach cruelty, he taught courage, the courage to stop hoping and start deciding. So breathe in now, feel how your chest rises, no longer burdened by the need to be liked, and breathe out gently, let go of the need to be understood by everyone. You're not here for approval, you're here for legacy. The game has already begun, but tonight you stop being a spectator. And when the morning comes, you'll move with quiet force. You'll make decisions that echo long after you've left the room, and no one will ever again mistake your silence for weakness. Sleep well, strategist. Tomorrow belongs to you.